Some historical facts now. So the origins of attachment theory, where did it start? Where did it all begin? Um, it was first formulated by somebody called John Bowlby in the 1950s. Um, how Bowlby came about attachment theory was that he used to observe primates. So he used to observe monkeys and infant monkeys with their mothers, and he saw that every time that the mother was away from the infant, because they used to take the infants away for feeding or for vaccinations or whatever, um, both the mother and the infant used to show very distressing behavior. And it got him thinking about how human babies would react in situations where they were separated from their mothers. So what he did was that he was assigned, in a psychiatric ward in a hospital where they were housing children who had been separated from their parents. Parents had died, or the children were injured, or the children were institutionalized because they were suffering from trauma as a result of war. So he and his colleague Robertson actually started to observe these children who were separated from their parents as a result of war. And he he got very interested to see, or he really could make the connection between the primate behavior and the human infant behavior. Like, he could see similar traits in human children about being separated from their parents. So he started to log these reactions. So whenever children would come in and they were separated from their parents, or they didn't know where their parents were because their parents had died or they'd been separated during war, these children started to show typical behaviors. So he started to make a log of what these behaviors were, and he basically came up with three stages that you could see clearly in a child that was separated from its mother. The first stage was what he called protest, where the child cried and really showed anxiety levels were really high, showed a lot of distressing signs, a lot of biological distressing signs as well. So his heart rate, blood pressure, everything was out of control, and he would be very distressed that my mother is not around. So this is what Bowlby called the protest stage. The next stage, he said, was despair, where the child finally accepted that my parent is not around anymore, and they cried, and there was a sort of sadness and a sort of disappointment and sort of helplessness associated with the despair stage. Now, these two stages were common between monkeys and humans. The third stage, which is the detachment stage, where the child kind of became aloof and stopped crying, stopped showing any sign of distress, any discomfort, and so just sort of became very cool and avoidant of everything. And this is what Bowlby called the detachment stage, where the child detached from the feeling of losing the parent. And the third particular stage, he only observed in humans. So the first two, protest and despair, were common between monkeys and humans. But the third stage, the detachment stage, was something which he said was very unique only to human behavior. Monkeys would not detach. They would not show detachment. They would not show aloofness, coolness, avoidance. This was something which was very, very uh, peculiar and particular to the human species. So he started to study attachment theory even further. He started to log all the children that he saw from these war zones. That's how the attachment theory first came about. And he drew his basics of this theory from Freudian psychoanalysis, but he disagreed with Freud about one thing, which was that Freud said all instincts were either about survival or about the libido, which is your sexual drive. And this is where Bowlby strongly disagreed with Freud, because he said that even though children did have an instinct to survive, and they did have an instinct to remain alive, that was not the main reason of attachment. That survival was not it was also much more than that. There was an emotion behind it. It was not just biological, that I want to survive, so I must stay close to my mother. It was much more than that. Like I said, so Bowlby mainly disagreed on this point with Freud, saying that there is a social or emotional reason for infants' behavior towards the mother, and it's not just survival instinct. And Bowlby's own instinct theory was that he felt that the importance of the female caregiver and the infant's behavior towards the female caregiver, such as crying, sucking on the finger, clinging, these clearly showed attachment function. So these behaviors, according to Bowlby, were basically behaviors which were specifically designed by nature to grow attachment and to make sure that attachment would go forward and it would grow between the mother and child. At Bowlby's time, the role of the father and other caregivers, such as grandparents, was not assessed. Obviously, because it was a new theory, and rather Bowlby himself was not too keen on focusing on fathers and other caregivers, because he felt that the maternal caregiver, the mother, had a very special role, which a father or a grandparent or any other caregiver would not be able to necessarily fulfill. So Bowlby was very clear about the emphasis on the mother here. So you can clearly see that he drew some of his theory, some of his foundation was based on the Freudian Oedipus complex, which is where Freud talked about how children have a almost sort of sexual, romantic sort of obsession with their mother. And this was clearly a force in Bowlby's theory, because he really emphasized the mother's role in attachment theory. But he took the sexual aspect out of it. So he said it was not the survival and the sexual instinct which was driving this behavior, that it was actually much more than that, that there was bonding, there was love, there was emotion in it. Now comes Mary Ainsworth. So Mary Ainsworth was actually a student when Bowlby was already working, and she was highly fascinated by Bowlby's work. There's a lot of history behind how they got together, but I'm not going to go into all of that. She moved with her husband to Africa, and she was living in Uganda for a very long time, where she actually started picking up Bowlby's theory of attachment. And she went to many different houses where there were infants in the village, and she started to just sit and she used to just observe mothers and infants. And she collected a lot of data, which apparently is still available even today, and nobody's really bothered to go through that data, but it's very valuable data, because it's kind of data which we have on attachment from a very, very primal, primitive, culture, which is Africans in Uganda. So that data is still lying somewhere, but we don't know what's happened with it. So that's how she started her work on the attachment theory. She later worked at Johns Hopkins University. You must have heard this name a lot because of COVID-19. They are the leading university on health in the United States right now, and they have been keeping a close eye on COVID-19, and they have been giving updates on their research with COVID-19. And their updates and their research is the one that is being taken as the ultimate word on COVID-19. So she later worked at Johns Hopkins University. And then she moved to Baltimore, USA, where ultimately she formed what she called the strange situation test to study attachment, which is basically a 20-minute laboratory experiment consisting of 8 episodes. So what happens in this test is that first a mother and an infant are made to sit in a room. They are given a little bit of time to get comfortable. The infant is given lots of toys to play with, and the mother and infant are interacting with each other, and they're sitting and talking and playing and things like that. All this is being observed through a two-way mirror, behind which a psychiatrist or psychologist or a researcher, whoever, is watching the interaction between mother and child. Eventually, a strange person enters the room and starts to join the mother and child's play. Once the child and a stranger are a bit comfortable with each other, the mother leaves and the baby with the stranger, and she goes away. And about after 2 minutes, she comes back. She returns briefly. Then after a few minutes, both the stranger and the mother leave the infant alone to play by themselves. And then the mother basically comes back, or the stranger comes back to the room, depending on what you're studying. Now, if you're studying the infant's behavior towards a strange person, then obviously the stranger would come back. But if you're studying the infant's behavior towards mother specifically, the mother would come back. Or you can have both come back at different periods to see if the child shows an automatic preference for just any human or their particular mother. So Ainsworth was particularly interested in the infant's behavior when the mother returned to the room, because she felt that that would clearly show attachment and the attachment styles playing out in that particular episode. And she clearly observed that there were different responses in different babies and mothers. So it was not universal, it was not all the same. And she started to log these responses and she started to make data out of it and collect it. And she clearly started to see categories which were visible. And that's how the typology of the attachment style was born. When we talk about attachment styles, that's what it means, that those categories of how those babies reacted to their mothers differently. So this is just a brief illustration of the attachment theory, the strange situation test, how it plays out. You can see here that the mother and child are introduced to the room. It's a comfortable room. There are toys, and there's a two-way mirror where where the psychologist is watching this whole thing. Then the stranger enters, and she starts to interact with the baby and the mother. After a few minutes, once the baby is a bit comfortable with the stranger, the mother leaves the room and she leaves the baby with this strange person. Then the mother returns and the stranger leaves the room first. And then eventually the mother also leaves. And then the baby is left alone to play. And then depending on what condition you are interested in studying, you can have either the stranger returning first or the mother returning first, or both. Ainsworth did many different variations. She's even done variations with, I think, fathers and things like that. So then to basically see how different attachment styles play out with different individuals.